I'm going to maybe start with the UNDP and get the voice of a development economist who's had experience looking at blueprints of this nature and how they speak to foreign policy, not only in an African context, but his experience spans over to Asia as well as the Caribbean and other parts of the world. So I'm going to ask Mr. Khalid Malik just to give us a very brief, in 2 minutes, your key takeaway of the conversations that we've had this evening.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for your the opportunity to interact with you on this, and thanks to the Minister for outlining the way South Africa intends to respond to various challenges in foreign policy and how to connect it to domestic interests and domestic agendas. Originally, we were talking about 5 minutes intervention. We went to 3 minutes, and now it's 2 minutes. So I'd like to see how best we can respond to that. I think what I can best do is to try to bring a kind of a global perspective on the changing world. And I want to just highlight several points to more raise it for conversation and discussion as part of the debate. First, which was highlighted by the Minister, but also our professor from Wits University, is that we are fundamentally talking about the changing world. And we had a Global Human Development Report in 2013, which talked about the rise of the Global South. And it's characterized by several factors. First, the issue of diversity. It's not just the BRICS. It's actually much more than the BRICS. And as I've said elsewhere, that if the Industrial Revolution is a 100 million person story, this current change of the world is a couple of billion people story. People in many parts of the world are doing much better, and we had estimated 40 plus countries doing better than expected. That was the first point. The second is connectivity. Globalization is part of our normal lives now. What we see, how we are connected through social media, other places. We know what's happening not just in South Africa, but in China, in the US. We are connected, and that has implications. The third part is actually if you look at some of the big links, North-South trade, which was the dominant motor, is now the same value as South-South trade, both about 30%. By 2030, 2/3 of the world's middle class will be in Asia. Huge implication. China, just to give you a quick figure, China-Africa trade was $2 billion in 1999. Last year, it exceeded $200 billion. So in some ways, we're coming to what I call a three-engine world economy. The US, Europe, and the developing world. When one engine is not working, the two engines can still move the world forward. But when two engines are not working, then everyone is affected. So what are the implications for South Africa? What could be some of the issues? First, South Africa has a considerable strength and role, as the Minister also highlighted, in shaping the future, not just for South Africa, not just for Africa, but I would venture to say for the Global South and the world, by doing a couple of things. First, making foreign policy increasingly be driven by solidarity and economics. Actually, economics, I try to outline big picture trends which would make a big issue. Become a natural base for new and renewable technology. That is the future for a sustainable economy, a sustainable world, especially when China and other emerging countries are beginning to reshift the global locus for industrial development. Next, taking an open stance. And what do I mean by that? As was also highlighted earlier, the huge wealth of development experience where we hope UNDP can be helpful. And I'll give, again, very specific example. The Bolsa Familia program of Brazil actually takes up a relatively small percentage of the total budget, but has impacted the lives of 40% of the population. Very interesting experiences which can transform South Africa, and through South Africa, Africa itself. Investment flows. China has been the leading recipient of foreign investment flows. But this year, actually last year, figures, it is now $100 billion comes into China, but it's also now $100 billion goes overseas as investment. So you have opportunities which are quite considerable. China has 100 million tourists going every year overseas. And Chinese tourists per capita spends the highest amount of money, even higher than Japan. So this new world needs new institutions and new mechanisms. And I would venture to say that the BRICS Development Bank is the beginning, not the end. We have an opportunity. There was a recent APEC meeting in Beijing where a proposal was also launched to set up an Asian Infrastructure Bank. I think we need to think of these issues where we can invest in Africa to connect that highway and one which I'm just beginning to see myself go all the way up to the north. A final comment. We have new institutions, but we also have to recognize that globalization has brought new risks. Not just economic, but also health risks. We know the Ebola virus. Avian influenza can start in one place and very rapidly spread because of the way the world is connected. So we have an opportunity and a responsibility to reduce risks. If you remember when the Asian financial crisis took place in the 1990s, there was talk of creating an Asian monetary fund, which could not go very far. But we should be able to prevent an issue that a bank collapses in New York and starts a great recession for the whole world. So in the 2014 Global Human Development Report, we have actually highlighted the creation of regional monetary funds to pursue counter-cyclical policies so that we can manage these things better and set up new institutions to make regions and the world safer and less risky. I will stop at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Malik. I think we've drawn some considerable examples, not only from the global south, but I think you've given us quite a bit to chew on, and there'll be lots, I'm sure, to come back on. Let me come to this side and speak to the Executive Director of the Institute for Global Dialogue, Dr. Sphamandla Zondi. And maybe, Doctor, you can manage 2 versus the 7 minutes that just happened on this side. And just get a quick response from you as well in terms of what stands out for you from what we've heard from the minister, from the professor, and whether there are any conflict points from what you've heard that you think we should be addressing in the debate going forward?
Thank you very much. I would like to mark out two points. One is the ongoing debate. We're going to always have to have discussions on how you strengthen linkages between the domestic imperatives and international relations without subjecting international relations to narrow national interests, and without sacrificing national interest merely for some international good. That balance is a shifting balance. No one ever gets it. I know no country that has got it perfectly. That is because it is about a dynamic environment. The international environment is not a controlled environment in a laboratory. You are relating with states that are organic, that have got to interpret and reinterpret themselves almost on a daily basis. And in our case, it is complicated by the fact that we are a state in making. We are a country in making. We are in a process of transition. And that brings with it shifting identities about who we are. There is an identity we would all aspire to be, but the old identities continue to be with us. There is a shifting balance of forces internally that explains in very clear terms the relationship between government on the one side and business on the other side. That even when government adopts a particular view, it doesn't follow that business is going to follow that. The second point I wanted to make is that, but perhaps there is a lot that we have in South Africa's experience thus far, since 1994, to draw from. One of the latest examples is how we have approached the opportunities around the ocean economy. With the so-called Operation Phakisa ocean economy idea, we bring together people from stakeholders from a variety of sectors to work together to identify how do you translate the opportunities that amount to 177 billion US dollars into real economic activity and 1 million jobs by 2033. And that produced very specific points of consensus involving business, involving government and other stakeholders around marine transport and manufacturing, around aquaculture, around ocean governance, around oil and gas exploration. That is giving me a lot of hope that we are experimenting on how we could actually implement the entire NDP in a manner that helps us manage these deep-seated challenges of the making of a developmental state that is in progress. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Zondi. Let's get another academic, Professor Pandi Pillay. He's a professor of economics and public finance at Wits School of Governance. And again, Professor, you are at liberty if you want to just take on some of the issues that we've heard maybe from Dr. Zondi as well as from Mr. Malik, in addition to what the Minister and Professor Anthony van Niekerk have raised, if you can, in 2 minutes.
Well, good evening, everyone. This is beginning to feel like a 100-meter relay rather than a panel debate. But let me say that picking up on the points that almost all of the speakers have made, from the economics perspective, I think that the NDP should be much more sensitive to the fact that national interests and regional interests are not incompatible. In fact, the development of South Africa is very much dependent on the development of the continent as a whole and of the region in particular. So that's the first point I'd like to make. The second is that Africa is referred to as the growth continent by international agencies such as the World Bank and others. And there is growth in many places, mainly because of the exploitation of natural resources. And alliances between what I would call weak states and multinational capital. But there is no development across the continent. Africa is still the continent of underdevelopment. And I think that where the National Development Plan can be useful, or is most useful, is that it highlights the notion of the capable state. And the capable state, I think, is an essential precondition for driving development. And if we succeed in developing the capable state, I think that would be a very effective role model for the region and for the continent. As an academic, I can afford to be a bit more critical of the NDP. I think that it's too inward-looking. I think it needs to be much more proactive in suggesting how we can carry through some of these growth and development initiatives to enhance the region and the continent. And in particular, I think of the issue that the Minister referred to as the infrastructure issue, which I think is absolutely critical, its development, for spurring trade in the region. And I want to suggest respectfully to the Minister that the 1 billion rand that she's getting from the Germans should go into infrastructure development fund for the region.
And last but certainly not least, Dr. Prince Governor, the Deputy Chair of the South African Human Rights Commission, to give us your view.
Thanks very much. I suppose a few quick points. The NDP starts with the recognition of the apartheid spatial geography and how deeply entrenched that is. And our work in the Human Rights Commission, for example, on water, reiterated that fact. In relation to that, I suppose the key question of the use of natural resources, the exploitation of those natural resources, for who and in whose interests and with what impact, I think would be critical questions to look at. You have a country like Nigeria, which has had incredible growth in the last while. The question is, do we not need to interrogate that growth? Because at the same time, you've got high levels of poverty and inequality, etc., in Nigeria. And so the issue of what's our understanding of the impact of the human rights impact of economic policy choices across the continent, and how do those increase or decrease poverty and inequality? And if we look at not just South Africa, not just Southern Africa, but the entire continent, it's extremely wealthy in natural and mineral resources. Yet there's high levels of poverty, inequality, and we have followed economic prescriptions that haven't managed to address that. So the question is, to what extent are we doing things differently? And I suppose to interrogate those policies right now. So, I mean, I'd like to just quote Nyerere, who said, at the World Bank, they asked me, how did you fail? I responded that the British ruled us for 43 years. When I left, I took over a country where 85% of the adult population was illiterate. There were 2 engineers and 12 doctors. When I stepped down in 1988, there was 91% literacy, and nearly every child was in school. We had trained thousands of engineers and doctors and teachers. The per capita income was $280. 10 years later, 10 years after 1988, when he stepped down, the per capita income had halved to $140. Enrollment in school had fallen to 63%, and conditions in health and other social services have deteriorated. In those 10 years, Tanzania has done everything that the IMF and the World Bank wanted. So I asked them, what went wrong? Unquote. I think it's absolutely critical that we interrogate notions of growth and development in terms of their human rights impact. To return to the issue of water in our country, if you look at rural water, 95% of rural water is used by 1.2% of those who own agribusiness, mining companies, and other industry. How are you going to solve the problems if you're going to have that situation? The second example I want to give is really around the issue of whose lives does the policies value. Everybody says that to be able to address the right to food, security, sovereignty, and hunger across our continent, in our country, we have to look at small farmers and subsistence farmers. Yet the work of subsistence farmers in keeping Africa's children alive, and in a context where in our country over 60% of our children live below the poverty line, how are we valuing that when in fact we're allowing across the continent land grabs and other resource grabs? And at the same time, we're allowing, in our country, for example, our staple food is now genetically modified, and most of our seed is owned by global corporations like Monsanto, etc. So I suppose what I'd like to ask about is the issue of policy coherence from economic policy to human rights policy, and how will government address that? The last is really the issue of Ubuntu. And Ubuntu is really about that interdependence, the interrelatedness of humanity. And that must be reflected then in our economic policy choices. And we can't conflate the interests of business as the interests of a country. And the question of who has access to the diplomats. Do the poor have access to the diplomats in our country, across the continent, across the world? Thanks.
Thank you very much.